Some things don't arrive by chance. They arrive when the truth is ready to be seen. The wind moved low across the Wyoming plains, brushing the dry grass in long, restless waves as dawn crept slowly over Caleb Turner's ranch, painting the horizon in pale gold and ash. The air held that quiet weight just before the world fully woke, when even the smallest sound carried farther than it should. Caleb had risen early, like always, his boots worn smooth at the heel, his hands already dusted with the work of a life spent outdoors. But something felt off before he even reached the barn, a stillness too complete, like the land itself was holding its breath. The wooden gate creaked softly as he pushed it open, the familiar scent of hay and weathered timber greeting him. But underneath it lingered something else, something unfamiliar, faint but undeniable, and it made him pause. He stepped inside slowly, each footfall deliberate against the packed dirt floor, the dim morning light slipping through the cracks in the barn walls in thin, silver lines. And then he saw it. In the far stall, standing perfectly still as if it had always belonged there, was a horse Caleb had never seen before. Its coat was a deep, weathered brown, darker along the spine, catching the light in quiet, muted tones, and its mane hung loose and untamed, shifting slightly with each slow breath it took. It didn't startle. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its head slightly lowered, its eyes fixed not on Caleb, but somewhere beyond him, as though it was listening to something distant, something only it could hear. Caleb frowned, his brow tightening as he stepped closer, instinctively scanning the ground. No tracks, not in the dirt outside, not inside the barn. The earth was smooth, undisturbed, as if no animal had walked across it in the night. A cold thread of unease worked its way through his chest, subtle but steady. Horses didn't just appear. Not out here. Not without a sound. Not without a trace. Easy, he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the horse or to himself. The animal flicked one ear at the sound of his voice, but its body remained calm, grounded, as if it had already decided there was nothing here to fear. Caleb took another step, slower this time, studying it more carefully. There was a mark along its neck, just beneath the mane, partially hidden by shadow. A scar. Not fresh, not jagged, but old, shaped in a way that felt deliberate, almost like a symbol worn down by time. Something about it tugged at his memory, faint and distant, like a word on the edge of being remembered. He stopped just short of the stall door, his hand hovering over the latch, and that was when he noticed it. A piece of paper, nailed to the wood, just above eye level. The edges curled slightly, yellowed with age, moving gently in the morning draft. Caleb stared at it for a long moment, his heartbeat slowing, deepening, the quiet around him growing heavier with every second. This hadn't been placed here last night. This had been here longer than that. Much longer. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the rough surface of the paper, feeling the brittle texture beneath his skin before pulling it free. The barn seemed to fall even quieter as he lowered it into the light. The handwriting was steady, firm, written with a kind of certainty that didn't ask to be questioned. Caleb read the words once. Then again, slower this time, as if hoping they might change. But they didn't. They stayed exactly the same. And behind him, the horse exhaled softly, a slow, steady breath that filled the silence like a quiet answer waiting to be understood. Caleb did not move for a long moment after reading the words, his eyes tracing each letter as if they might shift under a different light. But the message held steady, quiet and certain, and something about that certainty unsettled him more than anything else in the barn. He turned the paper over, half expecting more, another line, a name, anything that could anchor it to a person, but the back was empty, worn smooth by time. The horse shifted then, not stepping forward, not retreating, just adjusting its weight with a soft scrape against the dirt, and Caleb glanced back at it, his jaw tightening slightly as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "You belong to someone," he said, his voice low, measured, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile stillness had settled between them. The horse lifted its head just enough for its eyes to meet his this time, dark and steady, holding a depth that did not feel wild or frightened, but aware, almost deliberate. It was not the look of an animal lost. It was the look of something that had arrived. Caleb exhaled slowly and reached for the stall latch, his hand hesitating only for a second before he pulled it open. The hinge gave a soft groan, and the sound seemed louder than it should have in the quiet barn, but the horse did not react, did not flinch or step away. It simply watched him as he entered the stall. Up close, the details became clearer. The fine dust settled along its coat, the faint lines of muscle beneath, the old scar along its neck more visible now. Its shape curved in a way that suggested it had not come from accident or chance. Caleb raised his hand carefully, giving the animal time, space, a moment to refuse if it wanted to, but it did not. His fingers brushed against its neck, the warmth of it immediate and real, grounding in a way the rest of the morning had not been. The horse let out a slow breath, steady and calm, and for a brief second, Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, something he could not quite name, but it carried a weight that reached deeper than the surface of things. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, pressing against the barn walls with a low, steady force, and somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of metal tapped once, twice. A hollow sound carried on the air. The horse's ears flicked sharply at that, its muscles tightening just enough for Caleb to feel the change beneath his hand, and then it stilled again, returning to that same quiet watchfulness. Caleb pulled his hand back slowly, his gaze narrowing as the pieces in his mind refused to settle into anything clear. No tracks. An old note. A horse that did not act like it should. He stepped out of the stall and closed the latch behind him, his eyes drifting once more to the open space beyond the barn doors, scanning the pale light stretching across the land. Whoever had brought the horse here would have needed time, effort, a reason, and yet there was nothing. No sign of a truck, no broken fence, no trace of movement in the dirt road leading up to the ranch. It was as if the night had simply placed the animal there and left without a sound. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into the pocket of his jacket, his fingers lingering for a second as if expecting it to disappear, but it stayed where it was, solid and real. Behind him, the horse shifted again, this time turning its head slightly toward the open barn doors, its gaze locking onto the distant line of hills that cut across the horizon. Caleb followed that line with his eyes, the faint outline of trees barely visible in the morning haze, and a quiet thought pressed itself forward whether he wanted it to or not. Whatever this was, it was not finished. Not yet. Caleb did not answer right away, but the weight of Lily's words settled into him with a quiet insistence that was harder to ignore than the note itself, and he found his eyes drifting back to the horse as it stood there, steady and waiting, as if it had already made its decision long before either of them had stepped into the barn. The morning light had grown stronger now, slipping through the wooden slats in wider beams that cut across the stall floor, illuminating the dust in slow, drifting patterns, and in that light, the horse seemed almost unreal, not in the way of something imagined, but in the way of something that did not fully belong to the ordinary world Caleb knew. He pushed himself off the post and stepped forward, his boots pressing firmly into the dirt as he reached for the latch once more. "If it leaves," he said, his voice calm but edged with something deeper, "we follow." Lily did not argue. She only nodded, her hand still resting lightly against the horse's neck, her fingers moving in slow, absent circles as if she had already accepted what was coming. Caleb opened the stall, the hinge giving its familiar groan, and for a moment, nothing happened. The horse did not rush forward. It did not hesitate either. It simply stood there, its head lifting slightly, its ears angling toward the open barn door where the light spilled in, and then, with a quiet certainty, it stepped out. The sound of its hooves against the packed earth was soft but deliberate, each step placed with care, as though it was following a path only it could see. Caleb moved aside, watching closely, his instincts alert now, every sense sharpened by the strangeness of the moment. Outside, the wind had picked up just enough to stir the edges of the grass, carrying with it the dry scent of the plains and something else beneath it, something faint and distant that Caleb could not quite name. The horse walked past him without pause, crossing the yard in a straight line toward the open gate, its gaze fixed on the far hills as if nothing else existed between here and there. Lily followed first, her pace quick but steady, her eyes never leaving the animal. Caleb came after, his steps measured, his mind working through possibilities that refused to settle into anything solid. At the gate, the horse slowed just enough for Lily to reach it, her hand brushing along its shoulder as it passed through, and then it continued, moving out onto the narrow dirt path that cut through the land. Caleb stopped for a brief second at the threshold, glancing back at the barn, at the quiet space it had occupied only minutes before, and then he stepped through as well, pulling the gate closed behind him out of habit more than thought. The path stretched ahead, winding slightly as it led toward the low rise of hills in the distance, a distance that looked closer than it truly was, as it often did out here, where miles could fold themselves into the horizon without warning. The horse did not slow. It moved with a steady rhythm, its pace neither rushed nor hesitant, as though time itself did not press against it the way it did against everything else. Caleb fell into step behind it, his eyes shifting between the ground and the horizon, searching for any sign that might explain what was happening, but the dirt beneath them remained undisturbed except for the tracks they were making now, fresh and clear in the morning light. After a few minutes, he noticed something that made him stop short for half a step, his breath tightening. Slightly in his chest, the horse's tracks were the only ones. There were no older prints beneath them, no overlapping marks from the night before, nothing that suggested it had walked this path to reach the barn. It was as if its journey had begun the moment they opened that stall. "Dad," Lily called softly ahead of him, her voice carrying back on the wind. Caleb looked up to see her standing a few yards closer to the horse, her gaze fixed on something just beyond the next bend in the path. He moved forward quickly, closing the distance between them, and when he reached her side, he followed her line of sight. The land dipped slightly there, the path curving along the edge of a shallow ridge, and beyond it, half hidden by the tall grass and the angle of the earth, stood the faint outline of something man-made. Weathered wood. A structure. Small. Still. Waiting. The horse did not pause as it approached, its steps steady, its focus unbroken, and Caleb felt that same quiet pull tighten in his chest again, stronger now, as if whatever waited ahead had been calling long before this morning, long before the note, long before the horse had ever stepped into his barn. The structure came into clearer view as they moved closer, its outline sharpening against the pale sky until the details began to separate from the distance. A small cabin set low into the land, as if it had been placed there, and then slowly forgotten. Its wooden walls faded to a dull gray, the roof sagging slightly at one corner where time and weather had pressed their quiet weight against it. Caleb slowed without meaning to, his steps shortening as something deep in his chest tightened, a recognition that did not come all at once but crept in piece by piece, like a memory that had been buried too long to rise cleanly. The horse did not hesitate. It moved straight toward the cabin, its pace unchanged, its focus fixed as though the distance between it and that place had been measured long before this morning. Lily walked just behind it now, her expression steady, her eyes taking in every detail without the same resistance Caleb felt building inside him. The air shifted as they crossed the ridge, the wind, losing some of its edge, replaced by a stillness that settled over the clearing around the cabin, a quiet that felt different from the open land behind them, more contained, more deliberate. Caleb stopped a few yards back, his gaze moving over the structure, noting the way the door hung slightly off its frame, the single window clouded with dust, the absence of any recent sign of life. No tire marks, no footprints, no movement, and yet nothing about it felt empty. The horse reached the front of the cabin and finally slowed, its steps coming to a halt just beside the door. It lowered its head slightly, not in rest, but in acknowledgement, as if it had arrived at a place it already knew. Lily stepped up beside it, her hand brushing along its neck again, her voice quiet but certain. "This is where it wanted to go." Caleb did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the door now, on the weathered wood and the faint marks etched into it over time, scratches that might have been nothing more than age, or something else entirely. He moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, the ground beneath his boots firm and dry, the silence around them pressing in tighter with every inch. When he reached the door, he paused, his hand hovering just above the handle. The same hesitation he had felt in the barn returning, stronger now, rooted in something deeper than uncertainty. He pushed the door open. It gave with a low, drawn-out creak, the sound stretching into the still air as the interior revealed itself in slow pieces, shadows pulling back to make room for the light. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of scent that came from years of standing untouched. Yet there was something beneath it, something faint but present, like the echo of a life that had not entirely left. Caleb stepped inside, his eyes adjusting as the light filtered through the window, casting pale shapes across the floor. The space was small, a single room with a narrow table against one wall, a chair tipped slightly to the side, and in the far corner, a stack of items covered by a thin layer of dust that had not been disturbed in a long time. Lily followed quietly, staying near the doorway, her presence steady but respectful of the space, as if she understood without being told that this place held something important. The horse remained outside, just beyond the threshold, its silhouette visible through the open door, unmoving, patient. Caleb moved further in, his gaze drawn toward the table where something rested, partially hidden beneath the dust, its shape unfamiliar, yet somehow significant. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the surface as he cleared away just enough to reveal what lay beneath. A small metal box, worn at the edges, closed. Caleb's hand lingered there, the air around him growing heavier with the quiet weight of realization, the kind that did not come from what he could see, but from what he was beginning to remember. And somewhere behind him, the horse shifted its weight once more, a soft, grounding sound that seemed to say this was not the end of the journey, but the place where it truly began. Caleb did not open the box right away, his hand resting on its surface as if the weight of it extended beyond the metal itself, pressing into something deeper, something that had been quiet for years but was now beginning to stir with a slow, undeniable force. The room seemed to hold its breath around him, the faint creak of the cabin settling into silence as the morning light shifted across the floor in narrow, deliberate lines. He could feel Lily just behind him, still and watchful, her presence steady but patient, and outside, the soft sound of the horse's breathing carried through the open doorway, a quiet rhythm that anchored the moment in something real. Caleb exhaled slowly and lifted the lid. The hinge gave a soft click, the sound small but sharp in the stillness, and inside, the contents revealed themselves piece by piece as the light reached them. A folded map, a worn leather strap, and beneath them, a photograph, its edges curled with age, its surface faded but not erased. Caleb's fingers moved carefully, lifting the photograph first, his eyes narrowing as he brought it closer, the image coming into focus with a clarity that struck deeper than he expected. Two men stood side by side in the picture, younger, their faces marked by the kind of quiet confidence that came from believing the world was still wide open. One of them was Caleb. The other, the memory hit not like a sudden blow, but like a slow rising tide, steady and impossible to stop. Daniel Hayes. The name settled into him with a weight he had not felt in years, a name he had not spoken aloud since the day everything had changed. Caleb lowered the photograph slightly, his jaw tightening as the past began to unfold in fragments, each piece sharper than the last. The cabin, the hills, the long summer they had spent working this land together before it was ever his alone. Lily stepped closer, her voice soft but clear. "You know him?" It was not a question. Caleb nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the image. "We built this place together," he said quietly, the words sounding unfamiliar in his own voice, as if they had been waiting too long to be spoken. He set the photograph down carefully and unfolded the map next, the paper stiff but intact, lines drawn across it in faded ink, marking a path that wound through the hills and ended right where they stood. But there was more. A second mark, deeper into the ridge beyond the cabin, circled in a darker hand, as if added later with greater urgency. Caleb stared at it, his mind working through the distance, the terrain, the years that had passed since he had last seen any of this. "There is another place," Lily said, her eyes following the line of the map, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that mirrored his own thoughts. Caleb nodded again, slower this time. "There always was." He reached for the leather strap next, turning it over in his hands, recognizing it almost instantly, not by sight alone, but by the way it felt, worn smooth in certain places, marked by use, by time. It had belonged to Daniel. He had not thought about it in years, had not allowed himself to. Outside, the horse shifted again, a single step, a soft movement that drew Caleb's attention back to the doorway. He looked up, meeting its gaze from across the room, and for the first time since the morning had begun, the pieces aligned in a way he could not ignore. The note, the scar, the path. This was not chance. This was not coincidence. This was something that had been set in motion long ago, something that had waited, patient and unyielding, for the moment it could finally be seen. Caleb folded the map carefully, placing it back into the box along with the photograph, his movements steady now, his hesitation replaced by something quieter but stronger. Acceptance. He closed the lid and stood, the weight in his chest shifting into something more focused, more certain. "We are not done here," he said, his voice low but firm, and Lily nodded without hesitation, already turning toward the door. Outside, the horse stood waiting, its gaze fixed toward the deeper line of hills marked on the map, as if it had known all along that this place was only the beginning, and that whatever truth had brought it here was still waiting, just beyond the edge of what Caleb had been willing to remember. The sun had climbed higher by the time they stepped out of the cabin, but the warmth it carried did not reach the quiet tension settling deeper into Caleb's chest, the kind that came not from fear, but from knowing that the past he had left behind was no longer willing to stay buried. He closed the cabin door slowly, the wood pressing back into place with a soft, final sound, and for a brief moment, he stood there, his hand resting against it, as if acknowledging something that had already begun to shift beyond his control. Lily moved ahead, her steps light but purposeful, her eyes already drawn toward the line of hills that rose beyond the clearing, the direction marked on the map, the place that waited. The horse stood just a few feet away, still and patient, its gaze fixed forward, its presence unchanged by the time they had spent inside, as though it had never doubted what would come next. Caleb walked toward it, the folded map now tucked securely inside his jacket, the photograph resting beneath it, closer to him than it had been in years. "You knew him," Lily said quietly as he came alongside her, her voice carrying that same steady certainty she had shown since the morning began. Caleb nodded once, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "A long time ago," he replied, though the words felt thinner than the truth they held. The wind picked up again as they started forward, moving past the edge of the clearing and into the rising land beyond, where the ground shifted from open plains to uneven terrain, the grass giving way to scattered rock and low brush that brushed against their legs with each step. The horse moved first, leading them without hesitation, its path steady, its pace unchanged, as if it was following something far more certain than memory. Caleb watched its movement closely now, noticing the way it navigated the land, not searching, not guessing, but knowing, each step placed with quiet precision, each turn taken without pause. After a while, the silence stretched long enough for the past to begin filling it, not in sharp flashes, but in slow, unfolding pieces that returned with a clarity Caleb had not expected. He could see Daniel again, younger, standing in this same land, pointing toward the hills with a kind of restless excitement, talking about something just beyond reach, something worth finding. Caleb had listened back then, but not the way he should have, not the way that might have changed what came after. "What happened to him?" Lily asked, her voice breaking through the quiet without force, but with purpose. Caleb slowed slightly, his gaze dropping to the ground for a moment before lifting again. "He left," he said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than he allowed them to show. Lily did not respond right away, but the way she glanced at him told him she understood there was more, something he had not said, something he had not faced. The path grew steeper as they moved deeper into the hills, the air thinning slightly, the wind carrying a cooler edge as it moved through the higher ground. The horse did not slow. It climbed with the same steady rhythm, its breath even, its focus unbroken, and Caleb felt that pull again, stronger now, as if each step forward was drawing them closer not just to a place, but to a moment that had been waiting for years. Then, without warning, the horse stopped. Its body stilled completely, its ears forward, its gaze fixed on a point just ahead where the land dipped. Slightly between two large stones that rose from the earth, like markers placed long ago. Lily stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she tried to see what had caused it to stop, but from where they stood, there was nothing obvious, nothing that explained the sudden halt. Caleb moved forward slowly, his boots pressing into the dry soil as he approached the spot, his breath steady but his chest tight, with something he could not ignore. As he reached the dip between the stones, the ground beneath him felt different, firmer in some places, softer in others, and as he looked down, he saw it. A section of earth that did not match the rest. Slightly raised, slightly uneven, not recent, but not untouched. He froze for a moment, the realization settling in before he could stop it, the pieces aligning with a quiet, undeniable clarity. Behind him, the horse let out a slow breath, the sound soft but final, and in that moment, Caleb understood that whatever truth had brought them here was no longer hidden. It was waiting, right beneath his feet. Caleb did not move for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the uneven ground as the realization settled into him with a quiet, irreversible weight, not sudden, not sharp, but deep and certain, like something that had always been there, waiting for him to finally see it. The wind passed lightly over the ridge, brushing against the tall grass and carrying a low, steady sound that seemed distant and close at the same time. But everything around him felt muted now, narrowed to the space beneath his boots and the truth pressing upward from it. Lily stepped closer, her voice softer than before, careful in a way that matched the moment. "What is it?" she asked, though her eyes had already begun to understand. Caleb swallowed once, his gaze still locked downward, and then he crouched slowly, his hand reaching toward the ground, brushing away a thin layer of dry soil with deliberate movements. The earth gave slightly beneath his fingers, looser than it should have been, shaped in a way that did not belong to the natural slope of the land. He did not dig further. He did not need to. The shape was enough. The placement, the memory rising behind it. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it entered. He did not leave, Caleb said quietly, the words barely above the wind, but they carried more truth than anything he had said that morning. Lily did not respond right away, but she did not look away either. Her gaze moved from the ground to Caleb, searching his face, reading what he had not said for years. "You told everyone he did," she said, her voice still gentle, but no longer uncertain. Caleb nodded once, the movement small, almost reluctant, but real. "I thought I could," he answered, his voice roughened by something deeper than the air. He sat back slightly, his weight settling onto his heels, his hands resting against his knees as the past unfolded in full this time, no longer fragmented, no longer distant. The argument, the decision, the moment he had walked away, believing that silence would hold, that time would smooth over what had been left behind. But time had not erased it. It had waited. Lily lowered herself beside him, her presence steady, her silence offering something Caleb had not allowed himself before, space to face what he had carried without words. "The note," she said after a moment, her eyes drifting briefly toward the horse, still standing just behind them, calm and unmoving. "Do not let him go back." Caleb followed her gaze, meeting the horse's eyes once more, and in that moment, the meaning shifted, clearer now, sharper in its truth. "It was not about the horse," he said quietly. "It was about him." The wind moved again, stronger this time, passing between the stones and over the ground where Caleb knelt, lifting the edge of his jacket slightly, as if urging something forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note, opening it once more, his eyes tracing the same words that had started it all, but they felt different now, no longer a warning, but a request, a final attempt to make something right. He looked out across the land, the hills stretching beyond them, the path they had taken now clear behind them, and for the first time since the morning began, there was no confusion left in him, only understanding. He wanted to be found, Caleb said, more to himself than to anyone else. Lily placed her hand gently against his arm, a quiet reassurance that did not try to change anything, only to stand with him in it. Behind them, the horse shifted slightly, its head lowering just enough to catch the light, the scar along its neck visible once more, that same mark Caleb had seen before, not as something random, but as something connected, something carried forward. Caleb looked at it one last time, and the final piece settled into place, not as a question, but as an answer he could no longer deny. "You brought me back," he said softly, and the horse did not move, did not react. It only stood there, as if the truth it had carried had finally reached the place it was meant to go, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy, but still, as if something long waiting had finally been set free. Caleb remained where he was for a long moment after the realization settled, his hand still resting lightly against the earth as if it held more than soil beneath it, as if it carried years of silence, regret, and something unfinished that had finally found its way back to him. The wind eased across the ridge, softer now, brushing past the stones and the tall grass with a gentler sound. And for the first time since the morning began, the tension in the air began to loosen, not completely, but enough to let something else through. Lily stayed beside him, her presence steady, her hand still resting on his arm, not pushing, not asking, just there, grounding him in the moment he had spent so long avoiding. Caleb slowly pushed himself to his feet, his movements measured but certain, and he looked out across the land again, seeing it differently now, not just as the place he had worked and lived on, but as something layered with memory, with choices made and left behind. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the photograph once more, holding it in the light, studying the younger version of himself beside Daniel, both of them standing with the kind of certainty that came from believing there would always be time to fix what mattered. He exhaled quietly and lowered it again, his grip loosening as something inside him finally shifted, not erased, not undone, but acknowledged. "We are going to make this right," he said, his voice steady, carrying a quiet resolve that had not been there before. Lily nodded without hesitation, her eyes moving from him to the ground and back again, understanding not just what he meant, but why it mattered. Behind them, the horse took a single step forward, then another, closing the small distance between them with the same calm certainty it had shown from the beginning. Caleb turned toward it, meeting its gaze once more, and for a moment, there was no mystery left in its presence, only purpose. "You stayed long enough," he said softly, the words carrying a kind of gratitude he had not expected to feel. The horse stood still, its breath slow and even, its eyes steady, and then, without any sudden movement, it turned its head toward the open stretch of land beyond the ridge. It did not rush. It did not linger. It simply began to walk. Caleb and Lily watched as it moved away, its form steady against the wide horizon, each step carrying it farther from the place it had brought them to, farther from the burden it had carried, until its shape softened against the distance and finally disappeared into the light. The ridge fell quiet again, but the silence was different now, no longer heavy, no longer waiting. Caleb looked down once more at the ground between the stones, then back at Lily, and there was no hesitation left in him. The path forward was not uncertain anymore. It was clear. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, toward the tools they would need, toward the work that remained, not just in the earth beneath them, but in the truth they would finally bring into the open. The wind moved gently across the hills as they walked, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant rain, and somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen but no longer unknown, the past had finally found its voice, not in anger, not in blame, but in something quieter, something that did not demand, but waited until it was ready to be heard. And for the first time in many years, Caleb was ready to listen.